Yeah, okay, great. So hi, I'm Natalia Fedorova, and I'm going to be presenting some work that I've done as part of my PhD, which should slowly be finishing. So my home discipline is evolutionary anthropology, and in evolutionary anthropology, we conceptualize human mobility in terms of regimes. So based on how human beings, where they choose to live, either as households or as communities, how often they choose to move within an annual pattern, let's say, and the sorts of locations that they choose to visit, we can construct a regime of that mobility. And these regimes have different characteristics, particularly in terms of the amount of time people spend in places, whether that's over a life course or an annual pattern. Different mobility regimes then also have differential impacts on the land use in their places of origin and destination, wherever they choose to stay. And my work has focused on how those impacts in land use then come back to influence mobility. So this sort of the effect of the constructed environment back on how human beings decide where to stay and how much to move is quite under-theorized and often ignored. The way that I've chosen to study this is through both a theoretical component and an empirical component. The empirical component was done in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, and areas called Ger districts. These are areas that surround the city core that have been settled for the past 50, 60 years, but most recently in the 19s after regime change. And they're environments in which migrants have come to, they've privatized land, and they've built housing. But crucially, the housing has been in two different forms. So some households have decided to build gers. So these are mobile, relatively low investment circular dwellings, you can see up there, while other households have decided either on arrival or after some years of living in the environment to build fixed houses that cannot be moved, that are relatively more investment heavy. So they're fixed, they're made of brick or wood or other industrially sourced materials. And this binary situation really allows us to have a look at how different mobility is related to different investments in the landscape. Just to stay here for a second, mobility is obviously never happening in a vacuum. It's being traded off with other decisions that households make, which means that we have to take this trade-off perspective. However, because human beings are fantastic at making trade-offs, they're often really difficult to actually spot in the empirical record. So if you just collect data without having the theoretical foundation or understanding that there's a trade-off that's being made, it is difficult to identify it in the data. And if you want me to ruin your day with examples of how that happens, find me later. But so part of my work has been really to focus on building an analysis pipeline that combines qualitative and quantitative work as well, that tries to help grapple with some of these issues. So on the qualitative side, I've done ethnographic fieldwork in Ulaanbaatar and then co-constructed a quantitatively facing survey with the local residents to be able to collect migration histories, get data on how they invest in the landscape, and also basic socio-demographic data. And then the theoretical component of my work has been building an optimality model with stochastic dynamic programming. Of course, I don't have so much time to get into the methodology, but if you'd like to hear more, find me later. The most important thing about this is that stochastic dynamic programming allows us to calculate an optimal strategy over time under a defined optimization scenario. So if you want to be somewhere in 20 years, what do you need to do? And the three behaviors that I've looked at is moving, saving, and building, and the trade-offs that those engender in the population. And then to compare that data with the to compare the predictions from the model with the empirical data from Ulaanbaatar, it's not enough just to eyeball them, but we can use techniques like approximate Bayesian computation to actually derive the parameter estimates for the model that are most likely to fit. So the way the results look is here on the left. In the rows, we have different optimization scenarios, and in the two columns that have the lines, we have whether housing is low in investment or high in investment. And the lines then represent the optimal strategy that's derived from the optimality model. So we can see here that when housing is less costly, building behavior tends to take off quite early on. That's the orange lines. The purple lines are mobility. So we can see that within the parameter space, mobility is always higher early on when people first come into the environment, and then it cascades down depending on how easy or difficult it is to find empty land to settle on and to build housing on. But again, like within the conditions, there are some trade-offs, and we can discuss that later if people are interested. then the result from the ABC is that we can infer the same sort of plot from the empirical data in Ulaanbaatar, even though, of course, we don't have data on the actual optimal strategy, but we can find the parameters that best fit under these model conditions and so compare it. And so we can see that the inferred optimal strategy for Ulaanbaatar, top right there, is that early on there's a lot of mobility as people try to find an appropriate plot of land. So it's really not that people come in and settle and build, it's that they move around until they find something appropriate. Building is relatively constant through time, but also is a little bit higher when people first come in, which I think is really interesting because also people will often move even after they've built a permanent house. And saving behavior takes off a little bit later to when people are in the environment. And so just to conclude, I would like to say that dynamics of systems, of which mobility definitely is one, require dynamic theory and justifiable analyses that we can stress test to particular conditions. And also, I think flexible mixed method pipelines allow for an easy integration between theory, data, and outcomes that we can use to look and also co-construct with the local population to identify which factors are important, which factors should be involved in the model, and what that changes about the predictions and how we compare it to empirical data, let's say. And finally, I just like to say that, like I said, I'm from evolutionary anthropology, and in that field, I think apart from this review paper, there's really little that is facing towards climate-induced migration, despite the fact that there's a long history of studying really how mobility regimes are built up from particular environmental conditions. And so, you know, I'm here trying to talk. And so if you're interested in any of these, please find me later and we can discuss more stuff. And with that, yeah, thank you.